If Hezbollah chooses the path of war, it will pay a very heavy price. Very heavy. But if it restrains itself, we will respect that and keep the situation as it is. This is the threat that came from Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, after Israel was once again attacked from another front over the past few days. Yes, you heard that right. Israel was struck once again, but this time on its Lebanese border, by the militant group known as Hezbollah.
Where Hezbollah has launched rockets from southern Lebanon.
Israel has quietly been trading airstrikes with the Lebanon base.
Israel's northern front heats up as missiles have been launched at Jerusalem from both Lebanon and Syria.
Hezbollah fired guided missile at an Israeli military vehicle, and Israeli forces responded by bombing Hezbollah outposts.
אני מזהיר את חיזבאללה, את נסראללה, לא לעשות טעות.
So what is happening? Well, on the 8th of October, the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah fired a barrage of rockets into Israel. The militant group launched guided rockets and artillery shells at Israeli-occupied positions in Shebaa Farms, causing damage and sparking the prospect of war on two fronts for Israel. The attack followed a praising of Hamas by Hezbollah, as the group promoted Hamas's killings and attacks. As you might expect, Israel has been retaliating with drone strikes and artillery fire on Hezbollah positions near the Golan Heights-Lebanon border. Hezbollah has not taken this lying down, as they have fired missiles across the border into Israel in a show of what the group calls solidarity with Hamas. This has been ongoing in waves, threatening to further expand and escalate an already unbearable conflict. One can only wonder what this will ultimately lead to. So who or what is Hezbollah? Why is it attacking Israel, and does this mean that Israel is outnumbered now? Also, why is Lebanon finding itself at odds with Israel? I'm going to answer these and more questions in today's video as we explore more on the violence that is reigning in the Middle East that has now brought Lebanon into play. First and foremost, please be sure to hit the like on this video as it helps us out with the algorithm, and let's start. We'll start with the obvious, Hezbollah. Hezbollah, meaning Party of God, is an Iran-backed Shia Muslim militant and political group based here in Lebanon. The group was formed in 1982 during Lebanon's 15-year civil war in response to Israeli forces invading southern Lebanon to expel Palestinian militants attacking Israel. I'll dive more into that incident later on in the video. You see, Iran formed the group with the objective to play a role in the Arab-Israeli conflict in support of Palestinians and to become a prominent regional actor. Now, the militant group has risen from a shadowy faction to a heavily armed force with major sway over the Lebanese state. The U.S. designates Hezbollah as a terrorist group associated with numerous attacks on civilians around the world, including bombings at U.S. and French military barracks in Beirut in 1983 that killed around 300 people. The European Union classifies Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist group, but not its political arm. Yes, there is a political arm, a military arm, and other arms. Much like Hamas, it too operates with different wings, each assigned to a different set of tasks. It holds a great deal of power in Lebanon in the form of its Shiite political party, which holds 62 seats in the country's parliament alongside its Iran-backed proxy militant unit. For those of you who might be wondering why another militant group is worth the talk and effort after so much destruction has already occurred, let me stop you right there. Hezbollah is not just some small, disorganized group. Hezbollah is what Hamas really wants to be like when it grows up. As bad as their terrorist actions have been, Hamas is weak when compared to the likes of Hezbollah. The militant group is a much more formidable fighting force and is widely recognized as the most powerful non-state military in the world. Its military wing has grown to overtake Lebanon's army as the main military force in the country, and it is powerful enough to defeat most Arab armies, making it the most powerful non-state actor in the region. The group is well funded too, with the US State Department saying that Iran provides most of Hezbollah's training, weapons, and funding, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. To no one's surprise, despite Israel's attacks on Lebanon that have resulted in a few deaths, Hezbollah's deputy chief Naim Qassem has reiterated that his party was fully ready to contribute to the fighting. His exact words at a rally were, "The behind-the-scenes calls with us by great powers, Arab countries, envoys of the United Nations, directly and indirectly telling us not to interfere, will have no effect." What he's saying is the militant group will not be swayed into non-involvement. So now that we know what the militant group attacking Israel is, let's step out of the frame so that we see Lebanon and how exactly it is involved in this. In order to understand Lebanon-Israeli relations, we need to go back to the very start of the matter, back to the very creation of Israel in the last century. It all started with the big question surrounding Palestine and its land. You see, back in the day, the Ottoman Empire controlled that part of the Middle East from the early 16th century. It was only after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire during World War I that Britain gained control of Palestine, which was inhabited by a Jewish minority and an Arab majority. At the time, both Israelis and Palestinians were struggling for self-determination and sovereignty over the territory, developing respective movements for their causes. In the years leading up to the end of the First World War, the great powers were already carving out land for distribution. In fact, in 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that was secretly negotiated between Britain and France planned to carve up the Middle East into spheres of influence and determined that the land in question was to be internationalized. The following year, in 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, expressed his government's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people in a letter to Baron Walter Rothschild, the head of the British wing of the influential European Jewish banking family. We will talk about the Rothschild family in another video. You would not believe the power this family wields. Nevertheless, this letter by Lord Arthur Balfour is where the conflict begins. To the Israelis, this official letter marks a formal utterance of the Israeli state's right to exist. But to Palestinians, it was an early sign of their dispossession. The letter marked the beginning of a slicing up of their ancestral land. The declaration in the letter also noted that it was clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, nodding to the overwhelming majority Arab population in the region at the time, who were about 80% of the population. As the years progressed and the Jews began to be persecuted, with particular emphasis on the horrible Nazi persecutions and the Holocaust, more and more Jewish people migrated to Palestine seeking a home. Throughout all this, both sides continued to assert their right to establish a state. This led to heavy friction between Jews and Arabs, as well as resistance to British rule. In 1947, the United Nations voted to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. That is the key part of all of this. The land was to be divided into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. Naturally, the Jewish leadership embraced the plan, but the Arab side rejected it, arguing that it was unfavorable to their majority population and it was never implemented. The following year, unable to end the strife, British authorities withdrew and Jewish leaders immediately proclaimed the founding of Israel as a state. Many Palestinians naturally objected, and a war ensued as creating a Jewish state meant a dividing of the territory, and also since no separate state for Arab Palestinians was established. Enter Lebanon. I want you to take a look at where Lebanon is relative to Israel and the whole region at large so you can understand a lot of what I'll be mentioning. Despite having the smallest army in the region by far, Lebanon responded to the call of war by Arab leaders in the region. The moment Israel declared its independence on the 14th of May 1948, the Arab coalition was ready. The very next day, the 7-member Arab League, including Lebanon, publicly proclaimed their aim of creating a democratic United States of Palestine in place of the United Nations partition plan for Palestine. The League then waged war on the side of the Palestinian Arabs, thus beginning the international phase of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. If you're a student of history or have been watching the past videos posted to the channel, you know what came next. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq were all soundly defeated and repelled by the Israeli forces, which occupied South Lebanon. This resulted in Israel signing armistice agreements with each of its invading neighbors. The armistice with Lebanon was signed on the 23rd of March, 1949 specifically. As part of the agreement with Lebanon, Israeli forces withdrew to the international border. By the conclusion of that war, Israel had signed ceasefire agreements with all of the neighboring Arab countries. The territory it now controlled went well beyond what had been allocated to it under the United Nations partition plan, incorporating much of what had been promised to the Palestinian Arabs under the plan. However, it was understood by all the state parties at the time that the armistice agreements were not peace treaties with Israel, nor the final resolution of the conflict between them, including the borders. It was merely the aftermath of war where the defeated had little to no say. This is where it begins to get interesting. Because much of the land was now owned by Israel, there was a mass immigration of Palestinians who had been living in those areas previously. Some say they fled, some say they immigrated, and some say they were forced out. I suppose each side has its own version. The point is that about 700,000 Palestinians fled, seeking new areas and new homes as they entered neighboring countries. By 1949, there were around 110,000 Palestinian Arabs in Lebanon living in camps established by and administered by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. The movement of this many Palestinians into the country created some problems of its own. You see, the vast majority of the refugees were Muslim, and at the time Lebanon was a Christian country. The Lebanese Christians feared that the Muslim influx would affect their political dominance and their assumed demographic majority. Accordingly, they imposed restrictions on the status of the Palestinian refugees. These restrictions included stipulations that the refugees could not work, travel, or engage in political activities. At first, the effects of these weren't really seen because, well, for starters, these refugees had just fled home and were living in camps. Secondly, the refugees were too impoverished to develop a leadership capable of representing their concerns. As time went on, the Palestine Liberation Organization, still at war with Israel, started recruiting militants in Lebanon from among the families of Palestinian refugees who had left Israel in 1948. Keep this point in mind, I'll come back to it soon. When war again reared its head in the 1967 Six-Day War, Lebanon rejected calls by other Arab governments to participate. The simple reason for this was Lebanon was far too weak to risk conflict with Israel. However, although Lebanon played no role in that war, it was not spared the implications that followed by the Arab states. Immediately after the war, because of the weakness of its central government and its proximity to Israel, Lebanon was identified by the Arab world as an ideal base for Palestinian terror. Again, I direct you back to the map. See how geographically well-positioned Lebanon is, especially if you are someone planning an attack on Israel, which, well, the Arab states were. From 1968 onwards, the Palestine Liberation Organization began conducting raids from Lebanon into Israel, and Israel began making retaliatory raids against Lebanese villages to encourage the Lebanese people to deal with the problem. However, tensions kept heightening. After an Israeli airline was machine-gunned at Athens Airport, Israel raided the Beirut International Airport in retaliation, destroying 13 civilian aircraft. This added animosity towards Israel from the Lebanese. This was the problem that Lebanon had. The unarmed citizenry could not expel the armed foreigners, while the Lebanese army was too weak militarily and politically. This meant they were now both at the mercy of Israeli retaliation and the Arab forces gathering within their country. The Cairo Agreement of November 1969 gave the PLO special status in Lebanon, and after their defeat in Jordan in September 1970, Yasser Arafat, then chairman of the PLO, the entire Fatah leadership, and its fighting force moved into southern Lebanon. This is when Lebanon officially became a training ground for terrorists from all over the world. The PLO was able to recruit sympathizers from other terrorist organizations and from the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees in camps across the country. During the 1970s, PLO terrorists carried out hundreds of cross-border attacks on Israel from Lebanon. One of the worst was the Ma'alat massacre, in which 26 people, including 21 students, were held hostage and killed in a school in the northern Israeli town of Ma'alat. Israel, on top of regular attacks, would also make it a point to retaliate against its enemies on Lebanon's land. A good example of this is how, in reaction to the 1972 Munich massacre, Israel carried out Operation Spring of Youth. Members of Israel's elite special forces landed by boat in Lebanon on the 9th of April 1973. And with the aid of Israeli intelligence agents, infiltrated the PLO headquarters in Beirut and assassinated several members of its leadership. Within Lebanon itself, trouble was brewing. Do you remember the Christian majority I spoke of earlier? Well, about that. You see, the influx of Palestinian fighters into Lebanon upset the delicate balance between Muslims and Christians in the country, and in 1975 led to civil war. Lebanese Christians seeking to restore the ethnic balance and free the country from growing PLO control looked to Israel for support. The two sides had a common interest: to drive the terrorists from their Lebanese base. Two Christian enclaves supported by Israel were set up in the south. That led to the establishment of the Israeli-backed South Lebanon Army under Major Saad Haddad. Beginning in May 1976, Israel supplied the Maronite militias, including the Lebanese forces led by Bakir Gamayal, with arms, tanks, and military advisors. The border between Israel and Lebanon was at the time nicknamed the Good Fence because of the alliance between the nations. Fearing loss of commercial access to the port of Beirut, in June 1976, Syria intervened in the civil war to support the Maronite-dominated government, and by October had 40,000 troops stationed within Lebanon. However, this was short-lived, as Syria soon switched sides. Much like Israel, the Syrians had used the civil war to gain a foothold in Lebanon. They had intervened in 1976, first on the side of the Christians, then on the side of the PLO. With close Syrian support, the PLO grew bolder and started to attack Israel, launching raids and the like. In July 1981, they launched a huge artillery barrage on northern Israel. Full-on war was narrowly averted through last-minute American mediation. The peace, however, was short-lived, as it only lasted a year. After that, Israel launched Peace for Galilee, an operation designed to drive the PLO and the Syrians from Lebanon, and pave the way for a peace treaty with the Lebanese Christian leadership under the charismatic Bashir Gamayal. In June 1982, Israeli ground forces quickly overran PLO positions in southern Lebanon. The Israeli army laid siege to Beirut, and during the conflict, according to Lebanese sources, between 15,000 and 20,000 people were killed, mostly civilians. On August 30th, Arafat and the rest of the PLO leaders were forced to leave Lebanon after intense Israeli shelling of Beirut. Gamayal, elected president in July, spoke of peace with Israel, telling Israeli leaders that he would come to Jerusalem as a second Sadat. 2 months later, he was assassinated, presumably by the Syrians who wanted to preempt the burgeoning Israeli-Lebanese alliance, which they saw as a strategic threat. The next day, Christian militiamen moved into the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila and butchered more than 300 unarmed civilians. Israel, which had allowed the militiamen into the camps to seek out Palestinian gunmen, was blamed for the massacre. Throughout the war, the world media had been highly critical of Israel and of its defense minister, Ariel Sharon, who was eventually forced to resign after an Israeli commission found him indirectly responsible for the killings. Still, Israel and the new Lebanese authorities were able to negotiate a peace deal in the spring of 1983. But a year later, under intense Syrian pressure, Lebanese President Amin Gamayel, Bashir's older brother, renounced the agreement. This was the moment that Hezbollah entered the scene. Shiite Muslims, influenced by the 1979 Khomeini revolution in Iran, formed the Hezbollah militia to oppose Israel. Israel remained in occupation of a security zone in the south to protect its northern border. That led to an 18-year-long war of attrition with Hezbollah, in which hundreds of Israelis died. In February 1992, Israel assassinated the Hezbollah chief, Sheikh Abbas Musawi, who was succeeded by the present leader, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. Two major Israeli air operations, Accountability in 1993 and Grapes of Wrath in 1996, followed persistent Katyusha. These were rocket attacks on northern Israel, but had little long-term effect. In May 2000, Israel withdrew from Lebanon to the international border in a move ratified by the United Nations. This resulted in the creation of what they call the Blue Line. Essentially, the Blue Line is a demarcation line between Lebanon and Israel, and Lebanon and the Golan Heights, published by the United Nations on the 7th of June 2000 for the purposes of determining whether Israel had fully withdrawn from Lebanon. It has been described as temporary and not a border, but a line of withdrawal. On the other hand, Hezbollah moved militiamen down to the border, and like the PLO before them, created a state within a state in the south. In September 2004, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1559, which called for the removal of Syrian forces from Lebanon and the dismantlement of all militias, including Hezbollah. The Syrians and Hezbollah ignored it, but the Syrians eventually had to pull out of Lebanon following some very uncalled for actions. You would think peace would have reigned at last, but no. In the 6 years following Israel's withdrawal, Hezbollah, with Syrian and Iranian support, had built up an estimated force of 12,000 to 14,000 Katyusha rockets capable of hitting a wide range of Israeli cities, towns, and villages. Under the Katyusha umbrella, Hezbollah militiamen felt that they could carry out cross-border attacks with relative impunity, confident that Israel would refrain from sharp retaliation for fear of triggering a massive bombardment of its civilian population. Moreover, both the Iranians and Syrians could use the Hezbollah threat to pressure Israel or intimidate their critics in the international community. By mid-2006, the situation had become strategically unacceptable to Israel. Tensions were high, and all that was needed was one more spark. And that spark came in July 2006. As you can expect, that's when things went boom. On July 12th, Hezbollah initiated diversionary rocket attacks on Israeli military positions near the coast and near the Israeli border village of Zarit. As this happened, another Hezbollah group crossed from Lebanon into Israel and ambushed 2 Israeli army vehicles, killing 3 Israeli soldiers and seizing 2. Hezbollah promptly demanded the release of Lebanese prisoners held by Israel, including Samir Kuntar, and an alleged surviving perpetrator of the Coastal Road massacre, in exchange for the release of the captured soldiers. Heavy fire between the sides was exchanged across the length of the Blue Line, with Hezbollah targeting IDF positions near Israeli towns. Throughout the conflict, the Israeli government responded with airstrikes, targeting Hezbollah positions inside Lebanon, followed later by a ground offensive designed to remove Hezbollah terrorists from southern Lebanon. Hezbollah retaliated by firing Katyusha rockets at Israeli towns and cities in the north of Israel at a rate of more than 100 rockets per day for the duration of the conflict. The conflict was messy. In Lebanon, the conflict killed over 1,100 people, including combatants, destroyed massive infrastructure, and displaced about 1 million people. Israel, on the other hand, suffered 42 civilian deaths as a result of prolonged rocket attacks being launched into northern Israel, causing the displacement of 500,000 Israelis. Normal life across much of Lebanon and northern Israel was disrupted, in addition to the deaths in combat. On August 12, 2006, the war ended with a United Nations brokered ceasefire in which the Lebanese agreed to take control of southern Lebanon from Hezbollah with the help of the United Nations. Over the years since then, Israel and Hezbollah have had several skirmishes, and several deaths have resulted from this. Israel accuses Hezbollah of several violations, and the reverse happens as well. However, there has not been any war as direct or as violent as the 2006 one, as both Hezbollah and Israel try to keep to their side of the blue border, as hard as that may be. But things have changed now, or at least they seem to have. With Hezbollah openly supporting Hamas, what could happen if they choose to also attack Israel in support of their ally? Well, the truth is that this war would then turn into something much larger and much more dangerous. It is possible that not just the whole region, but the whole world will be dragged into that conflict, igniting a global war. That is an outcome no one desires. To allow you to sigh, most analysts don't think that Hezbollah wants to provoke an all-out war with Israel. That's because of the basis of Israel's arsenal and allies. If these minor attacks escalated to total war, Hezbollah stands no chance and would be obliterated. I suppose, as with all things, time will tell. It's quite hard to make such judgment calls when Hezbollah sends messages to Hamas saying, and I quote, "Our hearts are with you, our minds are with you, our souls are with you, our history and guns and our rockets are with you." At this point, let's just see how the border conflicts pan out, as this conflict drags on day by day. What I do know for a fact, however, is that the Business Basics community prays for peace and tranquility in the region. If you want to get the most important geopolitical news today without the technical glitches, you should sign up for Global Recaps. Global Recaps is an email newsletter that shows up straight in your inbox, covering the world's most important news, and there's no third-party censorship on these topics. This is a short and simple email that takes about 5 minutes to read, with all the most important topics covered. On top of that, not only is it unbiased, uncensored, and completely free, but you can sign up right now by going to globalrecaps.com or using the link in the description and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in.